Depending on how long you've been gaming for, you're probably aware of either the Retron 5 or the newly released Analog Pocket. These are clone consoles. Many different companies over the years have produced these consoles to be able to play retro video games, with mostly all not being affiliated with the companies that are the original hardware owners. But of all the clone consoles that would be made for the general consumer, one brand during the 80s that would see a fair amount of rehashes were in the form of Coleco. On this edition of The Uncommon Valley, we look at consoles that were released in various regions around the world in the form of unofficial consoles, as we check out the wacky world of ColecoVision clone consoles. Developed by the Bit Corporation in 1984, having worked with both Atari and Coleco to develop software for either console maker. While the video game crash of the 1980s was still in effect for areas in the US, countries like Taiwan were still producing video game hardware with the release of the Bit 90. The console itself would be comparable with most ColecoVision and Atari 2600 cartridges, but the 2600 cards would have to be played via other means through a specialized port. The unique thing to note about this console is that while the computer resembles more of a Sega SC3000 home computer, but it unfortunately is not compatible with its software. Though interesting to point out is that both the SC3000 and the Bit 90 both used the then powerful at the time Texas Instruments video display processor known as the TMS 9929A. Aside from the very similar looks, it did use the same ideas for its keyboard to what the ZX Spectrum used by implementing rubber keys instead of plastic ones, and could access basic statements and graphic symbols based on a variety of button combinations, with function keys such as Control, Basic, Function, and a special symbol key. The display for the Bit 90 would be 256 by 192 pixels high resolution, and could display around 16 colors and 32 sprites. The Bit 90 would not be on the market very long after the computer's launch. Bit Corporation would go on to develop software for the then new Famicom and NES until its initial closure in 1992. Exactly 10 years to the day that they began publishing for the Atari 2600. Produced as an Australian home computer, would be released by the company Soundic in 1984, originally making Pong clones in a variety of titles for various consoles during the 70s and 80s. Soundic would make them out of Hong Kong as its base of operations. While it is originally from Hong Kong, it would be imported and sold by the trading company Hanimex, which mainly dealt with import technology. Thus would rebrand the console as the Hanimex Pencil 2. Very similar to the Bit 90, it would also use ZX Spectrum style keys, with it all being rubber and basic command input. The computer also contained 2 joystick ports, a SCART and composite output, and a spot to use cassettes. And since this is a ColecoVision clone, there's a separate module to plug into the system to play carts on. For the insides, it is an almost exact copy of the original ColecoVision's. Only minor difference is that the Pencil 2 uses double the kilobytes of RAM instead of the usual 1 kilobyte. There are other additional features that it is compared to the ColecoVision's, would utilize other abilities that would eventually rival the Coleco Atom, like using cassettes, a printer, with the also added feature of allowing the Pencil 2 to expand its RAM from either 16 kilobytes of upwards of a much more powerful 64 kilobytes of RAM. There was even an additional slot to use 5¼ floppy disks via its own module. While it isn't known how many actually made it to the Australian region, it is one of the earliest known examples of computers to ever make it to the market for that country. And still to this day, they are extremely hard to come by complete in box. With game preservation being a very hot topic, with Nintendo taking down 3DS and the Wii U eShops, will take hundreds of titles offline for good. While the topic of piracy has been debated over the years for classic and modern consoles alike, one country took hold of it with open arms to bring gaming to its people, the country of Brazil. With its taxes being so high, companies like Nintendo would not make a return until 2020, where they finally would release the Nintendo Switch. Which brings us to our final clone console, known as the ColecoVision. Produced by the Brazilian telephone company Splice, it is one of the many products designed for sale in the reverse market. Much like the various 2600 clones that flooded the market before it, the ColecoVision has been recorded as being the only unofficial released ColecoVision clone in the entirety of Brazil's history. Produced in a very short period, the ColecoVision was put out in the market with what was described at the time as being more expensive than other consoles that were out at the time, and would be deemed a commercial failure. The internals for the software are slightly modified from the original ColecoVisions, as the language would be translated Portuguese instead of English, and with a slightly different logo, with it saying ColecoVision instead of ColecoVision. The only major difference from just a simple language change was the design of the console itself. While the controllers maintained the original look of the ColecoVisions, the console itself was completely remade altogether. Even though there are ports for what looks like it could actually fit the original ColecoVision expansion ports, none are documented to work on the ColecoVision. Though while being rumored at the time, they were working on a ColecoVision 2600 adapter similar to the ColecoVisions that they released in the 80s. While the official number of the ColecoVision is not known, they have become one of the most rarest and sought-after clone consoles ever released for ColecoVision collectors, and have even been documented back in the late 2010s of selling for very high prices ranging anywhere from $500 to over $1,000 depending on condition, and if any of the games are included with the console. Check out the other videos on our channel today for more obscure video gaming history, and thank you for watching The Uncommon Valley as we look to the past into the present.